10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started.
April 11th, 1970 was a momentous day for millions of Americans as they watched the Apollo spacecraft carrying Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise to the moon lift off the ground from Cape Canaveral, Florida.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
But, as history has shown, not everything goes according to plan, and failure is not an option.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
The explosion and rupture of the second oxygen tank during the Apollo 13 mission quickly turned tragic as it began the race to return Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise back to Earth. This event urged both American people as well as world leaders to make efforts in assisting those working in mission control. On April 17, 1970, the command module triumphantly returned to Earth, splashing down into the Pacific Ocean. The Apollo 13 mission triumphantly influenced momentous change both in technological innovation and the political race for space exploration, and most importantly, brought the world together for a moment to save human lives from disaster. The Apollo program was developed to land man on the moon, furthering the United States' political influence and supremacy in the space race against the Soviet Union. After the successful landings of Apollo 11 and 12 missions, Apollo 13 was NASA's third mission to the moon. However, 55 hours and 53 minutes after launch, tragic difficulties developed nearly 200,000 miles away from home.
The flight of the Apollo 13 to the moon is in serious jeopardy this morning and is not going to make a moon landing.
This was all due to the explosion of the second oxygen tank on board. The spacecraft was comprised of three parts: the command module, also referred to as the Odyssey, which carried the astronauts during spaceflight, the service module, which housed the essential equipment, and the lunar module, nicknamed Aquarius, which would be the living quarters for the astronauts during their planned stay on the moon. Before the flight of Apollo 13, the second oxygen tank system was installed in the Apollo 10 service module, but was carelessly dropped onto the ground, damaging its internal heating system. Before launch, the oxygen tank was redesigned to draw electricity from a 65-volt DC ground power, overlooking the thermostatic switch, which regulated the temperature within the tank. As the temperature rose to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the switch welded shut, damaging the Teflon insulation on the electrical wires to the power fans within the tank. Nearly 56 hours into the mission, Swigert activated the cryostor, shorting the exposed fan wires.
The short circuit, it ignited the oxygen, and that was the tragedy.
Teflon caught fire, resulting in combustion and increased the pressure in the environment made purely of oxygen, causing the second oxygen tank to rupture. The tragic explosion damaged oxygen tank 1, fuel tanks 1 and 3, and caused the Bay 4 cover on the service module to eject from the spacecraft.
And it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space.
Roger, we copy your venting.
It's a gas of some sort.
That gas of some sort, mentioned by Lovell, was aeriform oxygen that escaped when the tank blew. Right before their eyes, the astronauts witnessed the essential resource they needed to breathe escape into space. The explosion significantly drained their oxygen supply and caused even greater damage elsewhere. 2 of the 3 fuel cells that supplied electricity to the spacecraft were also destroyed in the explosion.
Flight Econ. Go ahead, Econ. You better think about getting in the LEM or using the LEM systems.
What they knew they had to do, since power was gone in here, was get over to the lunar module and stay there. This would be a way that they could stay alive for the next several days until they could come home.
With fuel cells 1 and 3 almost instantly emptied and the second depleting, a limited amount of power remained in the command module.
There was nothing there that could support the command module except what they needed for re-entry.
Mission Control advised that the astronauts moved into the lunar module, which housed its own battery. This limitation of power resulted in sacrifices that had to be made, such as the cabin heating system. This left uncomfortable conditions for the astronauts.
You had to put up with decreased water to drink, you had to put up with the cold, you had to put up with lack of sleep, because there was no other choice.
Another tragic hurdle was the excess carbon dioxide. The unique air filtration system within the lunar module was only designed to last the duration of the planned stay on the moon of 33 hours. Filters on the lunar module were circular, while those in the command module were square, presenting Houston with the challenge of literally fitting a square peg into a round hole. Using materials found within the spacecraft, the crew was able to connect one end of the hose to the circulation fan and the other inside a bag, purifying the air and solving the carbon dioxide problem. Illness posed another challenge for the astronauts. Mere days before launch, the backup lunar module pilot, Charlie Duke, became infected with the German measles and tragically exposed Ken Mattingly, the planned command module pilot. Jack Swigert, the backup command module pilot, took over his position. Although he was influential from the ground, the outcome may have changed if Mattingly was alongside his crew. In Houston, there was an uproar of concern as thousands of men raced to work, even in the darkest of hours, to save our heroes. I saw a flood tide of Grumman engineers heading towards the building, anxiety evident in their tense, lined faces. Although it was 3 o'clock in the morning, it looked like the normal day shift start time of 8 a.m. The efforts of Mission Control were pivotal in the success of the recovery of the crew.
The triumph was how the flight controllers and mission control were able to handle the problem, work out what could be done, use the lunar module as a lifeboat, as it were, and work out all of the problems that had to be worked out to have enough power and enough oxygen and all of the things that we required to keep men alive. The people that worked in mission control and what they were able to do was a result of years of training and teamwork and discipline and study.
At this point in time, it was decided that the lunar module would never touch down onto the moon and would be unable to complete its mission to leave behind various scientific instruments. Instead, it was decided that a free return would take place, utilizing the moon's gravity to slingshot directly back towards Earth. April 17th, 1970 was a nerve-wrenching day for all who anticipated the return of the astronauts. Minutes after the descent sequence commenced, our heroes triumphantly splashed down into the South Pacific Ocean and was retrieved by the USS Iwo Jima. Aligned with the common belief that 13 is an unlucky number, Apollo 13 became one of the most famous NASA missions because of the numerous tragedies that occurred during the flight. Although both the spacecraft and the men aboard were American, Apollo 13 had an impact on the world as a whole. During these dark moments, millions of people were in fear. The concern was not just contained in America, but it stretched across the world into countries including Spain, Australia, Italy, Brazil, Uruguay, Britain, Germany, Holland, Japan, and France. These countries offered to provide assistance in various ways, including the use of the largest Australian radio telescope to provide clear communication with the crew and the dispatch of the French Navy to recover the astronauts. The United States' largest adversary, the Soviet Union, even offered to provide aid in returning the astronauts home. Headlines such as "Apollo in danger" became international news, striking fear into the hearts of many. Crowds gathered in the streets to read newspapers telling of the story of the men in space. Pope Paul VI prayed in the Vatican, many in Jerusalem prayed at the Wailing Wall, and a multitude of others around the world, such as in Guyana and Hungary, participated in prayer intercessions for the safety of the astronauts. Even for only 4 short days, the tragic events of Apollo 13 were able to bring unity throughout the world. Millions were captivated by this story, including many leaders and engineers who worked towards the common goal to save the stranded American astronauts. In addition, the tragedies in technology allowed for future success. After the mission, the heating and mixing components of the oxygen tank system, as well as the wiring within the spacecraft, were redesigned, along with the addition of a 400 amp hour battery, which would provide more than enough energy needed to get home in the event of another disaster. These changes not only affected future Apollo missions, but heavily influenced later space travel, including NASA's current Orion program. In conclusion, the story of Apollo 13 is an outstanding example of how sudden tragedy can quickly transform into a triumphant moment for all of mankind. While it never touched the surface of the moon, Apollo 13 is, as Gene Kranz describes, a successful failure. Although this event did not transpire the way it was intended to be, this tragic triumph still remains as a prominent event within modern American history.
An extremely loud applause here in Mission Control.